Snow had worked its will on Winterfell, softening the hard lines of the rebuilt walls and filling the breaks between age and new stone until the ring fort looked always as if it had just risen from a storm. Faint light bled through high, narrow windows, a sourceless gray that carried no warmth with it. The hall smelt of smoke and pine resin and wet wool, and of men, always of men. There was bread, but less than there had been. There was ale, though it thinned with water more days than not. The fires were built tall or short according to what the granaries could bear, and talk rose in gusts the way sparks did, brief, bright, lost in the draught. Jon Snow sat at the end of the high table with Longclaw leaning against the arm of his chair, as if it were a third, quiet companion. He had taught himself to look as if he rested even when his thoughts marched, and now they marched. Voices moved across the hall like a tide across shingle. Manderly's rich drawl, Lyanna Mormont's flint-bright pronouncements, Wolken's careful, dry observations. Sansa's voice did not need to be loud to be heard. When she spoke, people listened, as the room somehow made itself ready for her. Outside, the wind laid hands on the shutters and shook them. Outside, the gods would waited under its mantle. "Bread and salt for the men from the lakes," Davos said quietly beside him. They made 5 days' journey through the drifts and brought their grievances wrapped in rhyme. It would be wise to let them warm their hands before they warmed their words. Jon's mouth moved, and the shadow of a smile found him. It often did around Davos. "Bread and salt," he agreed and gave the signal. Servants trundled forth with trencher boards, the loaves scored by Wolken's careful knife. There was no Maester Luwin to chaff about the price of flour any longer. Death had made the accounting brief. Small folk in patched cloaks and salt-stained boots, with the stooped backs of men who had carried too many years on their shoulders and too little meat in their bellies, came under the high roof. 5 of them, a whole village sized down to what it could spare. A woman wrapped a strip of dyed cloth around her braids, the sort of bright scrap poor folk saved for feast days or funerals. She held a child asleep on her shoulder. A fisherman with hands like knotty willow roots glanced at Longclaw and made a sign without thinking, the old way, as if to keep off mischance. Jon watched their eyes move over banners and faces and the wolves carved in the beams, and he felt the weight of what those eyes expected, and what they did not dare hope for. He rose. He did not love to sit a chair that marked him more than any crown could, but the North had cried him king after the banners were raised in the snow, and the word had left a mark on him as surely as the blade at Castle Black. "Speak," he said, not loud, not soft. "There is a place for your words at my fire." The fisherman's cap sat in his hands, crushed like old bread. "My king," he began and stumbled, because he had never called a man that except once to Torrhen Stark in the stories his father had told. "We've kept your men fed as we could. We've kept the watchfires up. But the holders from Lord Glover's lands came and took the nets, and the taxman says there's a levy due for timber cut, though the ice took the dock and we must cut. We must cut to build it back. There's no seed for spring, if spring should come, and no promise of the next day's flower. The boys are at the wall or with your banners. The men who remain count what fish and wood remain, and the soldiers look and say we should be grateful for their looking." The woman with the child lifted her chin. "They took our boar last month," she said. "The beast had been in the copse 3 days, and we put meat aside for Widow Salla and her bairns. But the riders come and claim the hide and the hams both, and leave us to boil skins." "Riders bearing whose colors?" Sansa asked, as if the answer mattered more to her than who sat the high seat beside her. "The glove, milady," the woman replied, and spat that the child might never hear it in gentler words. "Then a man with freckled cheeks and the triax badge that says he serves Clay Umber. There's no law we can see, save a spear." There were a dozen ways to answer, and none of them could be made tidy by the mouth of a king. Jon felt the old pull. Anger a step too quick, pity that did no good past the relief of drawing breath, and the habit of finding the truth of a thing by its edges. He thought of the old gods, who looked on with wooden faces and said nothing, and of Mance Rayder, who had called to men and women who had never been asked to kneel to anything but hunger. He thought of his father, who had said that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, and of the night cold of the wall where men's words froze into their mouths and broke. He stepped down from the dais. At his movement, the hall shifted and watched him cross the rushes, watched Ghost rise from beneath the table, white as the day outside and twice as silent, and follow. Where there is a spear, there must be a law standing behind it, Jon said. Else a spear is only robbery with a handle. Lord Robert Glover has given much to the north. The Umbers have broken and bled and gone mad with their grief. None of that gives their men leave to steal from fields and nets without the right to do so. My father had his assizes. There were holdings and hearth laws written in days when winters lasted with songs. They were forgotten when lords took more upon themselves and the small folk had less to shoulder but hunger. The north has filled graves and burned pyres these last years. It will not fill the bellies of the hungry if we bury the old laws further. The fisherman looked at him as if a wolf had walked out of the woods and agreed to speak to men. What does that mean, your grace? Davos asked, the words mild, the look telling Jon that he had said enough for poetry and not yet enough for bread. It means, Jon said, and looked to Wolkan, to Sansa, to Lyanna Mormont, and then to the heads of the houses in the hall, that I will not have men taken from their boats by taxes they cannot pay in a winter when the sea is the only field that will give fruit. It means the right to gather deadfall wood is the right of every man and woman in the north, and no forester shall set a price to freeze their children. It means the soldiers of a lord will have quarter and hot stew at the king's order if there is stew to be had, but they will leave a writ for what they take, with the seal-branded tally we will read at Winterfell. And it means that the north will be asked to speak for itself, not only through the lords who have long borne the names, but through those who carry the water and the nets. There will be a way to be heard by more than a spearhead. Manderly's face gave away nothing but its fat, and his rings flashed when his hands turned. He had a manner of making everything look like a feast, even now. My king proposes to convene a moot, he said, as if he'd heard it already in Jon's tone. An old word to match our old gods. My lord father would have liked it. He liked the old words. He liked bones for pies and other old ways. Lyanna Mormont bared her little teeth in something that could have been a grin or a threat. A moot for the men who chop and fish and tend, and for the women who do the same, she said. Let them name a speaker from each 100 hearths. It will go hard with any man who stands between a bare island woman and the right to say what needs saying. That is not how the North is ordered, Robert Glover answered. He had not yet forgiven himself for any of the things he had done in the years of fall, nor had the room forgiven him except where kindness had been ordered to do so. We are not the wildlings who sit in a ring and make a law by the measure of who shouts the loudest. No, Tormund said cheerfully from his bench by the fire, where he had lately shared ale with men who had dreamed of killing him in years past. You are men who let a boy in red silk tell you what to do with your houses. And now you've got a boy in black. He lifted his cup in Jon's direction. A boy who died and came back with the chill in him and the wit not to set his prick on the same stove twice. We've got our way and you've got yours, and your way hasn't fed these folk. Sansa put her hands flat on the table, the gesture gentle but final. This will be done with thought, she said, not with shouting. My brother, my king, proposes a charter, the old words made new, and the new promises set down. The truth is that the North is too large for the voice of one hall to reach all corners. We can bind it with fear and force and break it, or we can bind it with law and make it stronger than hunger or madness. We will draft it. We will call speakers to the winter moot and read it before them and before you. Jon watched the faces in the hall turn to her. He saw Manderly's pleasure at the sound of the word charter, for he was a man who liked words you could roll on the tongue like the pearl of a pinch shell. He saw Davos relax a fraction. The smuggler knew the shape of this thing, a promise printed on paper and pressed by seals and made solid by the sense of those who would carry it. He saw Wolkan's head bow in thought, already beginning to tally clauses and antiphons and precedent. He saw some of the old men shrug because food first, law after. He saw Ghost watch them all as a hunter watches a clearing. After, in the quiet, he went to the Godswood. There had been no children's laughter in it for many winters. There had hardly been leaves. The heart tree's face looked not on him but through him, as it had on his father and on Brandon before him. and back into days when the snow lay above a man's head and walls were the size of mountains. He knelt with the ease of a man who had done this in boyhood and then had no time to do it in war. Snow fell into his hair and melted and sent water into his clothes. He felt its cold. "I don't know if I'm right," he said, which was the only prayer he had ever been able to manage without lying, and the only one the old gods ever seemed to answer, by giving him no answer at all. Ghost pressed his shoulder in a silent weight of warmth and wolf. He dreamed that night of long, low halls lit by rushlights, of men and women speaking in turn as the snow pressed on the roof, of stone with the faces of trees carved into it, and of a child's hand curled around a tally stick as if it were a blade. He dreamed of Mance Rayder in a hall of birch trunks, laughing without mirth as he reminded him that a king's first trick is to convince men that the crown is not a trick at all. When he woke, the world was the same world, and he set to changing it. Vulcan put quill to parchment and breathed as if the ink were incense. Davos said, "We'll need to know how far we mean to go with this, or else go too far at once and set the houses against us. The commons will cheer it either way, but you'll be left to stand with cheer alone." The table at which they worked had belonged to some Stark who had liked to scratch at its edges when thinking. The grooves made a rough map of Winterfell's hard decisions across 100 years. Jon stood looking down as Sansa spoke and thought how strange it was that the girl who had once wanted songs and court had learned the art of cutting from those who had cut her and now used it to stitch. "We do not break the North to save it," Sansa said, laying out the first of the clauses like so many pins. "We bind it closer to itself. The hearth law should be first. Every holdfast will set aside a portion of grain in times of plenty to be stored in sealed vaults overseen by king's tallymen and village headmen both. In winter, the seals will be broken by the two together, not by any lord's man alone. This we call the right of the hearth. The king will fund the tallymen? With what?" Manderly asked, finding his way into the room with the ease of a whale into water. His scents were cinnamon and lamp oil and boiled beef. He made the room feel like a feast even where there was only ink. "White Harbor can spare a ledgerman, two if need be, but you'll need more than ink. You need ships and salt and fish. Give me the right to the White Knife down to 2 bends below the Wolf's Den, and I'll give you 5 ships a month with cod and herring enough to keep stew in the bowls of the Moors." "You already have that right, as you have always had it," Davos observed dryly. "You've merely come to ask us to say it again with clean words and a clean seal." Manderly grinned. "What is law if not a way to make old thefts respectable?" he said, not ashamed. "I'll give you the ships all the same, if you give me words enough to make my men sing that they are doing it for the North and not for me." "The right to wood and water," Sansa said over their banter, her voice softening nothing. "Deadfalls, river shallows. No man shall set a price on deadwood gathered for heat or cooking, save that the king's tallyman may judge a tree cut green to be an offense and levy a day's labor in its stead. Netting in spawning shallows is forbidden, but the taking of fish for the pot with small hooks and baskets shall be the right of every home within a morning's walk of a river. Lina Mormont's I shone. Let any man who tries to take a bare island woman's firewood answer to me. Write that. We'll call it the right of the hearth," Jon said. "And the right of wood and water. Then the right to speak." He looked at the scroll and saw it as more than ink. A thing could be made real by speaking it aloud in the right place, beneath the face of a weirwood, before a fire that warmed friend and enemy both. He had seen vows remake men and break them. He had felt cold and then breath return. He would bind the North to itself with words and with a way for the words to matter. "Each 100 hearths will choose a speaker," Jon said, "by whatever way that 100 knows best, by old custom or by lot, by shouting or by silent look. Those speakers will come to Winterfell 4 times in a year and sit a ring in the Great Hall, and there they will give tongue to petitions and problems. No law that touches the commons shall be made without their hearing. I will sit among them when I can. When I cannot, I will send my hand to hear them with full weight." "Who calls the moot?" Vulcan asked, practical. "Who decides the time and the safety of the roads? Who keeps the peace when those who come to speak arrive with grudges they would also like to speak with their fists?" "We will," said Davos. "Better a hand than a steward for this. Hand of the King of Winterfell, if we must play at bright titles in dark days. We'll set justices of the king's circuit, riders with grooms enough to carry word and witness. Send them along the white roads, and let each justice hold court beneath a heart tree if there's one to be had, or in its shadow if the local gods do not mind. We'll read the tallies aloud. We'll count the seals. We'll make wrong things right where we can without lifting swords. Tormund snorted. You'll lift swords. Aye, Davos said. We'll lift swords when we must, but we'll yield to words when we can. Sansa's hand went to the seam of the parchment as if to smooth it. We must touch the free folk in this too, she said, looking to Tormund. Your people came through the wall starving and afraid, and then fought and bled for us. Let there be lands promised to them, clear and sealed with the king's hand, and let them have their speeches and their knives and their gods. We will not ask them to kneel to a faith they do not know. We will ask them to stand with us when standing is needed. We will promise them fire and a roof if the snow takes theirs. Tormund held her with a look that had the weight of all his dead behind it, and then said, simply, done. When the first draft was ready, the words lay in a single roll as long as Jon's arm, heavy as a good sword, seemed penned in Wolken's bookhand. Jon had known men who would die for a scrap the size of a palm if it had the right letters on it. He had been told once, by a maester of Old Town with a prim mouth, that all a king's power was only the imagination of those who believed in him. They lit extra torches that evening and fed the fires until the damp hiss turned to an eager roar. They swung the great doors to fill the hall with white breath. The first speakers to come were not yet named by the hundreds, but they were headmen and goodwives and old men, who had seen winters deeper than the present and remembered the days when a Stark could ride from the neck to the wall and be fed on bread and ale and pride alone. They sat and they stood and they shifted because their bones hurt, and they held their tongues because their tongues were sharp. And when Sansa began to read the charter, the hush was not silence but something fuller. She read of hearths and wood and water. She read of speeches. She read of the law of quartering, a clause that said soldiers would be fed and in turn would mark what they took, and the king would require the lords to pay in grain and coin what was taken. And any soldier who took without privity of ink would find his right hand bound before the heart tree to his oath and forfeit his wages for the winter. She read of the law of arms for the commons, by which every hearth would keep a bow and a spear if it could, and every boy and girl would learn to bend the bow enough to keep their roofs safe from wolves and worse, and of the watchers, villages' own watches that would be led, trained, and armed by the king's men but answerable to their own headmen. She read of the winter stores and the king's circuit and the justices. She read the guarantee that free folk could own air land on the same terms as any other Northman, and the room changed shape on the air without moving a stone. Right of arrow, Lyanna murmured with satisfaction, when Sansa came to the lines about bows, and when she had finished reading it aloud, Lyanna stood and said, I'll send you 100 girls who can put a shaft through a hanging pippin at 40 paces with a wind cross. I'll send my aunt's old longbows, 6 of them, taller than some men. Which is a mercy for those men, Manderly murmured to Davos to hide his smile. Arrows thrown by girls hurt less than the sharp words they throw. Robert Glover stood. His face had the color of wind-chapped stone. You would have me answer for every loaf my men take, every skin of oil, every plank for my ships. Cannot pay coin when I have none. If you would have me pay grain, where will I find it? In your granaries, Sansa said. In the tithes you gathered when there was meat and you were thinking of war against men and not the cold. We will count it with you and we will measure it fairly. You will not find me wanting in understanding of what you and yours have done. But I will not have widows boiling leather for supper while your taxmen reckon up how many pairs of boots were issued to your spears and what they cost. There will be a reckoning that does not bend to fear or favor. It will not go down easy, Glover said, but his voice had quieter in it, and the way he looked at the fisherman with his cap in his hands said he had remembered something before his brother died. They were still at table when Wolken shuffled forward, the parchment in his hand. He had dipped the king's seal in wax twice, though Jon had told him once was enough, and the wolf's head impressed itself in blood-red ovals. He had never thought to put his name to any law. He found his hand steady as he pressed the ring into the seal. Something in him relaxed that had been tense since he first tied black about his waist. He was binding himself as much as anyone else. The first test of the charter came fast as snow on a black cloak. 3 days after the reading, a boy came from a real hamlet east of the last river with tears icing his cheeks and a cut on his ear. He brought word that soldiers had taken bread and meat and left nothing but a shout over the shoulder. They were Glover's men, bivouacked in a coppice to shelter from a night's knife wind. The boy's mother had put her last onions in their stew expecting a loaf back, and their steward had laughed.
Jon Rode.
He took 10 of his guard and Davos and Lyanna Mormont because she had stood straight when he had wanted someone to stand with him who had never, even in thought, preferred the easy way to the right one. Ghost loped at their bridle step with white paws like absence. They found the camp by the blue smoke that made itself a signal, and the first man who saw Jon's banner raised his hand to shield his eyes the way a man does before an avalanche he cannot outpace. The soldiers stammered. Their captain was a freckled rider with a father's corners to his eyes. He bowed to the king and said in a voice that might have been bell or cudgel depending on how you heard it, "We took what we needed, your grace. There is not enough in our panniers to march on water." "Show me what you needed," Jon said. His voice made no promises to any side. His fathers had carried that trick too. They unstacked charcoal-blackened pots. They pulled back cloths. They set out loaves and hanks of salted meat. Jon looked and counted and imagined the mouths open for each mouthful. And in his head he counted the oath he had made aloud. "You took more than you had a writ for," he said. "Where is the tally? Where is the seal? Show me your steward." The steward had the look of a man who could see a hole he had stepped into after he had stepped. He held out a curled scrap with a seal that had been pressed too shallow to take the wolf's head. Jon took it and tore it, and the steward flinched as if he had torn skin. Davos's voice had that courteous rasp to it that made men who had thought themselves safe sit up. "You had a choice of how to cut this," he said, pointing with his chin at the stew pot and the spears. "You were given a way to take and pay both, and you chose to take and pay nothing. You made your choice in comfort when a woman in a cold house had none. Here is the law. Will you hear it with a mouth full of stew or empty?" "We were hungry," one of the men blurted, and then looked at the ground as if the ground would oblige him by opening. Jon nodded. "Hunger is the reason for law, not the excuse to break it," he said. "Captain, bring the men who ate, 20 of you by my count from the bowls. Bring your steward, and send for the woman in the real hamlet." They made a court there, beneath a bare oak whose bark had taken on the face of winter as if it had been a weirwood in its heart. The woman came with her boy, and she stood as if she had never thought the world would hold such a sight. A king and a bear girl, a smuggler, a wolf, and 20 soldiers whose faces could not decide how to wear shame. Davos read the clause of the charter concerning quarter and tallies. Then Jon judged it. He did not lift Longclaw because he had learned more than death from his father. "You will repay with your rations the meat and bread you took," he said. "For 3 days the hammocks will swing empty in your bellies. The steward will work in the woman's house and in the houses of her neighbors as she directs. He will chop wood and carry water and scrape hides and wear the apron he made the women wear while he ate. And each of you will carry to Winterfell a letter under my seal stating that you have taken without writ, so that Glover will know his house's debt to my stores. It will be accounted when he comes to sit the moot. The next man who takes from a poor house without writ will taste the strap, and I will witness it. And if he raises a hand to stop my witness, I will cut that hand free of him." The captain bowed as if he were bending to be ill, his shame no less for the relief on his face. The steward looked at the woman with eyes gone small. The woman looked at Jon as if she had never been seen by anyone who still had his sword in its sheath. When they rode back, the low sun threw their shadows out long as spears. Lyanna rode at Jon's knee, the top of her head barely higher than his saddle's pommel. "You should have given them the strap to make it stick," she grumbled. "It will stick," Jon said. "The unbelievers will be the last to feel it. A steward who cooks in a widow's kitchen will be talked of by other stewards. They are the ones who set the taking in order. They'll learn what order they answer to." "You are not as stupid as the songs make men," she said, which Lyanna Mormont thought was praise. You should still have used the strap. The strap would come. The strap would not be enough. Jon knew that. He had begun something, and the road to where it ended would be steep, and the snow would disguise the cliff where it fell away. There were men in the Bar-Rollins who did not like to see the world grow new with law they had not asked for. Lady Barbary Dustin sent no riders with complaints, but she hosted more fireside gatherings than had seemed necessary when there was less to gossip about. Men came from long leagues away to sit at her hearth and go away with their mouths pursed. The Riswells came to White Harbor and went away again with their packhorses loaded with salt beef and salt words alike. Robert Glover tried and found himself impatient too often with the soldiers he had not trained to this, and his steward found himself less welcome in the oatfields than he had hoped, and he took it as an insult when it was only the weight of the charter settling. The moot came together like birds circling to make a black cloud. From Last Hearth and Carhold's empty keep came raw-boned men and women with scars on their arms where grief had written itself. From White Harbor came fishwives with hands that smelt of brine even after washing, and a man with a ledger tucked under his arm as if it were a wife. From the rills came lanky men with straw in their hair and women with straw in their hair and hail on their tongues. From the moors came muddy boots and quiet voices. From Bear Island came 2 boats of girls who wanted to see Winterfell and make sure the king had hair on his chest. The gods would took their whispers and gave them back as low talk by the fires. They sat in a circle on benches dragged from corners and a ring marked on the floor by chalk. Jon did not sit above them. He took a place on the second bench, and Davos sat with him, and Sansa and Lyanna and Manderly and Wolken, and Robert Glover stood to one side with his jaw set and his brows a stiff line. One by one, the first speakers stepped into the ring and spoke. They were not used to it. Some spoke too fast, their words stumbling. Some could not manage not to apologize for speaking. Some shook. Then the ring found its own pace, and a woman who had crossed the Dreadfort's shadow every spring driving sheep to higher pasture stood and said without apology, "We know you remember, and that is a good, but remembering does not put fat in the pan. If this is to keep, it must keep like a door keeps, with a bar dropped across so no one can push it open at the first kick. Who drops the bar? Who holds the key?" They had answers to some things. They had time to hunt answers to others. They wrote the first names of the justices of the circuit on parchment. Ser Burren Tallheart, who had not died with his house under Fry knives. Hother Riswell's second son Wendell, whose mother had been a woman of sense. The old sergeant from Wintertown who had held the gates when spears bristled like hedges. "You are making yourself an enemy?" Davos told Jon that night when the hall was dark and the last of the fists had unclenched with drink. "Not 1, 100. Men do not like to find that the ground they have walked on forever is mud this year." Jon rubbed the heel of his hand against the smooth place Longclaw's pommel had worn in his palm. "Would that this were only about men," he said. "The dead do not care for law. They will come when they are ready, and the charter will not warm any man if we cannot set fire to it and make it burn hot enough to beat them back." "You should not talk of burning the king's own charter," Davos said, with a smile that was mostly old-tired. "I will burn every scrap in Winterfell if it will keep a child alive one more night," Jon said. "The dead were not a story. They were a cold you felt before you stepped out to piss, and a silence that meant every dog had crawled into its master's bed. Word came down from the last river that a village had vanished like a handful of salt thrown into the rain. It had never been anything but 20 roofs and a smith, but it had been a map in the minds of men who had walked that road since boyhood. The road found itself empty where it had expected a light. Jon had not wanted this to come before the charter had sunk its teeth deep, but wanting had little to do with winter or with enemies that did not need food, did not admit fear, did not give up a path once they found it. He sent word to White Harbor and the Bear and the Rills. He sent the justices with oak bark ink to the villages to knock and say, "All the heads of houses, mark your hearth fires. You are bound to answer the horn now." And he built horns where there had been none. It was a bleak march to the White Knife where it ran narrow under old stone. Manderly's men had piled brush in barrels soaked in oil and pitch. Davos had taught them that trick and the cheaper trick of setting it alight with dry reeds and fast hands. The watchers had gathered, and they looked like the commons because they were bowed, stout, gap-toothed, scarred, hungry, stubborn. The first thing they did was work. They pulled ropes until the frost in them cracked. They shoved with shoulders. They found new angles under old beams until black water lapped against the piers of the bridge and sloshed back. The second thing they did was sing, because men always sing when work and fear come together, and it makes a sound that carries. When the dead came, the watchers blew horns and the sound went across the river like an animal's cry. It came back from the fields and from the woods beyond and from the white hill where the heart tree watched. The dead moved like fog and like men and not at all like men. Their eyes saw nothing and everything. They did not slip in the mud. The watchers were made of breath and fear, but they had spears and bows and oil and words that bound them and fires that would take even a thing that felt nothing. Davos stood on the bridge and shouted to light the faggots and then shouted to light the next and the next, because he had learned long ago that people could work faster just by hearing someone say the things they knew they had to do. Manderley's ships sat with empty holds so they would ride higher, and their crews had knives clenched in their teeth the way fish have hooks in their jaws. Lyanna Mormont was not there because he would not let her come to stand with the dead, and she would hate him for it until they were very old or very dead. She had sent girls with bows, and they kept their strings dry under oiled leather. Jon stood where he could see much and not enough. Longclaw felt lighter than it had when he had swung it to kill men. You could not look at the dead too long and keep your head. You could not look at anything else and keep it either. He kept it by looking at the watchers, the way a copper-haired girl adjusted her stance after every arrow to find a better angle, the way a boy twice too young and 3 winters too thin did not run when the first thing with blue eyes reached a hand for him over the fire. They made a wall in pieces and they held through the first press, because that is what law is, when it is made right, a wall made by hands. He killed where he had to. A dead thing wore a riverman's clothes and had a woman's hair, and he cut it down and stepped through splinters without letting himself see the shape of her face. Davos took a spear through his sleeve and cursed and kept shouting. A ship lurched and a man spilled into black water and came up blue and keen and had to be pulled back by 3 ropes at once. Somewhere behind them Manderley bellowed a song about a whale, and the dead did not stop for it or for anything. The watchers' fires held. The dead did not learn. That was a strength until it was not, and when darkness found blacker darkness, they turned back because there was a cage the dead could not see but knew, in whatever part of knowing they had left, that they could not go through. They did not feel rage or disgust. They felt nothing. The living felt everything at once and fell back against barrels and each other and let out breaths they had not known they were holding. When the last of the blue lights faded into the white night, men who had never liked each other found that they did not dislike each other anymore, and women who had never held hands did it, as if it were something they had always known to do. Jon stood on the bridge as if he were the last bit of it left, and Ghost nosed the back of his knee, and he saw that a boy with hair the color of ash had the charter's tally mark sewn into his sleeve because his mother had stitched it there. It was a round mark with a wolf's head within, a sign you could draw fast in a dim room when the king's rider said, "Do you claim your right of hearth?" The boy's sleeve was torn where hands had caught it, and his eyes were too wide, and he had not pissed himself, and Jon felt like weeping and laughing and sleeping for a week. The morning after, they counted their dead. That took time, as it always did, and when it was done Jon had Wolken read aloud the names that had been given to them. He read the names of commons and of men who had once owned more than a name. He read a girl's name and the name of an old man with no sons, and the name of a boy who had come down from the lake village with tears frozen on his cheeks and now would travel no more roads. The hall took those names like stones added to a cairn. No song rose. There was only the clink of cups raised without speech and the scratching of Wolken's quill as he counted what had been lost and what remained to spend. That was when the knife came. If a man speaks too much of law, other men begin to think that law is something they can put a point on and slide between a rib and a heart. He had expected a blade one night sooner or later. The North had too many proud men and too many grudges. It came not from Robert Glover, who was too honorable to send anything but a rider with a complaint, nor from Manderley, whom Jon would never trust entirely, nor yet from Lady Barbary, who would have liked to be caught and admired for the neatness of her work. It came from a minor squire who had in him a measure of hurt pride and a measure of hungry father and a larger measure of fear. He had been given a pouch of coin by a man who had been given a larger pouch by another. There were always pouches. The squire came in at the servant's door with a butcher's apron on and a blade meant for cutting meat. He slid along the shadows in the hall with all the caution of a boy who had watched cats and thought he could learn from them. Wolken sneezed in the corner. Sansa turned a page. Ghost was under the table because he was always under the table when Jon ate, and the squire did not think that the white under the table could be anything but the cloth thrown down in case of spilled ale. When the boy struck, the blade scraped on Longclaw instead of ribs because Ghost's teeth had closed on his wrist and the hand had gone off aim. The scream that tore out of the SQ wire shattered the quiet like a band of iron snapping. Jon stood not because he thought about it, but because his body had learned that trick long ago. He had the boy by the front of his apron and had him on his back on the floor, and everything he had learned since the wall and since the knife in his own heart told him that he could end this with one short movement and Anders would have done it. He did not. Davos was there with his foot on the boy's wrist and his knife at the boy's throat. His eyes were bright low coals. Sansa's hands were still as water in a basin that hasn't been touched. "Who sent you?" Jon asked, after he had backhanded his anger from his face and found the weight of his own voice again. "No one," the boy said too quickly, which is how boys say everything they think they cannot say slow. "I did it for the old way. My father says this. He says you'll make a Snow Lord out of a miller if you keep on. We will make a Northman out of those who have bled for the North," Sansa said, as if she had been waiting to say it all week. She stood and came around the table and looked down at the boy with her hair the color of autumn above her shoulders like a cloak. "And we will make a full belly out of the Lord's stores, even if the lords gnash their teeth when we count the sacks. We will make a North woman out of a fisher girl with a bow. We will not make a Snow Lord. You did this because someone wanted to see if we believed our own words or whether we would run to the strap and the axe the first time we were tried." Jon nodded to the guards and stood back. "Bind him," he said. "Send word to the speakers. We will not try him behind closed doors." The small folk rode hard through thick drifts to be present. There were more of them every time they were asked to come. They had not been asked often in their lives. The hall filled with halted breath and cheap wool, and the smell of men who had come out of the snow and gone only as far as the door to shake it off. Jon took the chair because he must. Davos stood at his shoulder and Sansa stood at his other, and Lyanna sat on the table itself with her legs dangling like a boy's. Wolken read out the charge and read out the clause of the charter that named a crime against the person of the king, and for the first time they tried it. "What do you say to this?" Jon asked the squire, and he saw the boy's scared youth under the broken crust of his bravado. The boy was not much older than he had been when he had first touched Longclaw. "I say I did it," the boy said and swallowed. His mouth had traded all its saliva to terror. "And I don't beg mercy for it because my father says mercy makes men forget to be strong." "And what does your mother say?" Sansa asked, and it might have been cruel, but her voice was not. "Does she live?" "She does," the boy muttered miserably. "She says mercy makes men grateful and strength without mercy makes enemies." He hated that he had remembered it here. "Did your father send you?" Davos asked, as if he were asking if the soup had salt. "No," the boy said. He looked down. "He said someone asked him to ask me. He said I might do it if my courage held. He said men would sing if they thought he had told his son to do it, but they would cut my throat if they thought he had. He said many things I did not understand, sir." The speakers talked in their ring. They did it so quietly at first that it sounded like the wind under doors. Then one stood and then another. A woman from Wintertown said, "If this were the day before yesterday, he would be dead already." An old man from a croft near Barrowton said, "I've seen too many dead boys to take joy in adding one more. Let him serve the rest of his days learning how to use words like a man and not a knife like a boy." A bear girl from Lyanna's boat stood with her chin up and said, "Let him go cut wood for the old women who are too stubborn to leave their huts. Let his hands burn with blisters until he knows what pain is when it is useful. Let us not raise a martyr," Manderley said softly enough that the room had to lean to hear him. "The men who set this pipe for us to trip on wanted blood to spill and be seen and talked about. They wanted the North to whisper that a boy died because a king is afraid of insults. Let us deny them that joy." Jon looked at the boy and wished for a long moment that Ned Stark were there to tell him what a Stark would do, because he still had no idea what that was. Then he looked at Sansa and found in her the truth that a Stark would ask of his sister when he did not know. He made the judgment with the ring of speakers nodding and the lords watching and hating him a little less because he had not taken their weapon. The boy would lose the hand that held the knife. No, Jon caught himself before he spoke, feeling the line of his thought like the edge of a blade. He would not make a liar of himself the day after he had told a soldier he would cut hands. He would save the boy and stain his own words. The truth was hard. By the charter, the crime against the person of the king is high, he said. But a king is least a man when he makes everything managed by the weight of the crown. You did not cut me. You cut my sleeve. If I had died, you would die now. You wanted to strike to show others courage and to earn your father's pride. I will not give you that pride. You will cut wood for a winter for widows and holdfasts, and you will do it under guard. You will learn to read. Wolkan will set you letters. You will spend a month in the wolf's den with Manderly's marshals and see what the world looks like for those who have nothing, and then make a sworn service to a house not your father's. I will ask Glover to make his name into a word that means something else than hunger and pride. If you try to flee, you will lose your hand. If you are ordered by your father to do something you know is wrong, you will come to a speaker and tell him. If you do not, I will cut more than your hand, and your father will hear it in his sleep forever. Hear and go. He felt the room breathe. He felt Manderly's look like an approving weight, Davos's like a brace, Sansa's like a hand on his shoulder, Lyanna's like a small savage smile. He felt the lords whose names he could not see in the dim corners shift, the sound like wolves changing position in the dark. After that, the charter began to live. It lived in the mouth of a brewer who told a half-drunk soldier to take his hands off her daughter, and then took him by the ear to the headman to have a letter sealed and carried. It lived when a boat sent dry fish upriver to a village it had never visited and received back a letter saying, in clumsy hand, that the debt was noted and would be answered in turn when there was beer. It lived in Lyanna's laughter when a speaker from the lonely hills tried to shout down a widow's complaint and found 20 pairs of eyes frowning at him like the face in the heart tree. It lived in the justices' worn boots and the winter sores on their lips from talking too much in cold air, and the callus on Davos's mouth where he held his pipe without lighting it just to keep from swearing aloud. The men who had made the boy's blade did not stop with one trick. They were not fools, and they had held lands for a long time by using fear more than law. Lady Barbary's fireside talks turned to talk of old wrongs and new slights. A Ryswell steward refused a tally and was strapped by a justice in the square, and the Ryswell cousins decided that law was not to be born when it came from a smuggler's lips. Brave men rode by night and took down the king's tally boards and planted in their place boards with their own marks burn-stamped deep. All of this Jon poured back into the circuit like water down a rutted road. He sent letters. He sent speeches. He sent ghosts. He went himself when it would change the color of men's faces to see him. And winter went about its business meantime and made every small quarrel seem small indeed. The dead came again and were beaten again, and the second time there were more watchers, and they had learned how to pass oil without spilling it and how to keep the flames alive in the cold. A girl from the wolf's den ran messages as fleet as a hound. A boy from Bear Island died with 3 dead things at his feet and his mouth set in a line that would never break again. Manderly went leaner in the face and more dangerous in his eyes as he counted what his men could carry to White Harbor and what they had to leave for the moors, and the old humor sharpened instead of dulling. "We'll boil my rings if we must," he said one night, lifting a hand full of gems to toast the king. "They'll make a fine soup. We can call it Lord's broth." Sansa came into her own the way a maiden comes into a dance she has watched all her life and thought she would hate. She received the women of the north in the solar under the slanting light and heard their complaints and their ideas and the quiet details of the way men behave in houses, and she added to the charter without asking permission. She set down in Wolkan's careful hand the right of the cradle, that the mother of a child born to winter would be given 3 days of bread and meat and 2 of coal from the holdfast store, and no steward would ever demand payment for them, and the right of safe bed, that no man would be forced to share his bed with a soldier, and any soldier who tried would work a month for the house he offended and keep watch at night under the worst weather until his shame ran out of him in sweat and ice. Put it in the law and men will learn to be ashamed before they have to taste the strap, she told Jon. Shame is cheaper than rope and kinder too. Davos nodded as if it were an old wisdom, he had always known and never spoken. "Let them think shame is a clever man's trick," he said. "Maybe it is. A trick to keep men living." The winter took a fuller breath and sent it down from the wall like a thing with lungs. The moors whitened and hard crust formed on the drifts until men could walk where they had sunk to their thighs before. The dead used the same roads because they were roads and because even a thing with blue eyes must take the best path when it comes to it. The watchers knew better every time where to set their fires and how to read the wind. Some of them had eyes that saw farther in snow than other men's did, and those eyes led. And in the quiet between raids and reckonings, the charter sank its roots down into the frost. A boy who had been a squire learned to read in the wolf's den and thought that his mother had been right and that mercy could be a sort of strength you cudgel yourself with until you got used to its weight. He went to Glover not as a spy but as a servant and learned to count grain in a different way. Robert Glover's jaw softened half an inch, and he began to see that every tally reckoned now would make for fewer quiet dishonors later. Lady Barbary sent a loaf to Winterfell with a coin baked into it and a letter that said, in her hand that looked like the bones of things, "There is some merit in a game you have invented that I did not think I would like. Do not mistake me for tame." And Jon smiled and did not make that mistake. They had a feast of sorts when a caravan from the Shivering Sea came over the King's Road from White Harbor, and for a night there were pears in the hall, gnarled, hard things that tasted of ice and salt when you bit them, the sort of taste you needed in winter because you couldn't find it in meat. Pears for 100, fish for twice that, bread for all. Jon lifted his cup and spoke without flourish. "This comes of us," he said, "of your bowstrings and your cold fingers and your legs that walked aloud the roads to hang tallies on posts and take them down again. If you don't want to hear the word law now, eat another pear in the name of the same. We are. Be still hungry. We will be hungry again tomorrow. We will eat all the same, and when we cannot we will not starve alone in our beds but together in our halls and by our fires, and then we will find more." Manderley toasted him with a snort and a wink and a belly laugh that had less belly behind it. "To the king who asks us to starve together," he said. "May the gods bless him with the thick head to keep asking and the brave stomach to sit at table and do it with us." In the spring, which is to say in a slightly less murderous week, the Wintermoot sat a ring that filled the hall. The faces that looked back at Jon were easier to name than they had been at first, and the shapes of their mouths said that they had come to like the sound of their own voices and the work those voices could do. They added to the charter. They took away from it. They argued about whether a man could be counted as a hearth if his house had burned, and then agreed that the name of hearth would mean what a man could carry in his hands after a fire if he could carry his wife with it. They decided that the mark on the tally board in a village would be a wolf's head for the king and the sign of that village, so that a traveler could tell where he was without asking anyone and know what the law called that place so that he could complain about it by name if he had to. It was Sansa's thought to seal the charter not with one thing but many. "Let them do more than scratch their name if they have one," she said. "Let them bring a thing of their hearth to press into the wax, so that when a child asks what this law is, her mother can show her a bit of bark or a nail and say, 'This is our promise, and the king's too.'" They did. A fisherwife pressed a net weight into the wax. A boy brought a chicken feather, and Wolken pretended to scowl and found a way to make it stick. Lina Mormont pressed the tip of an arrow. Manderley pressed a ring, a small one he could afford to miss. Davos pressed the edge of a coin with a ship on it. Jon pressed Longclaw's pommel and made a wolf's head where the wax was still warm. Last, a woman from near the Dreadfort came up with a bundle wrapped in a shawl. She laid it on the table and unrolled it. It was a small carving of a heart tree's face made in driftwood. A careful hand had made the mouth shaped like a question and the eyes kind. She pushed it forward. "My husband used to put it on the mantle," she said. "We put it there when we were married, and we took it down to make room for a baby's shawl. And now there is neither husband nor baby, but there is this. We called it the Answerer. Let it be part of this, and then when I look at it in a museum of law in my head, I will know I didn't keep it for nothing." Jon took it and turned it in his hands and felt the smooth places from a thumb and the rougher places where a falcon's beak had made tooth marks before they had carved them to mean something. He pressed the wooden face into the wax, and when he lifted it there was a face in the seal. Eyes narrowed but not angry, mouth not smiling but not closed either. He looked up, and for a heartbeat the hall was not a hall but a wood with many faces. He stood to speak but found he did not have a speech set in him. He had tried to write one and the words had refused him. He let what he had flow. When I was a boy, I thought law was something my father carried in his head and drew out like a sword, he said. Then I thought it was something the wall poured over men like water, so they could stand against the cold without falling. Then I thought it was the dangerous warmth of a campfire in a snowstorm, that you wanted it too much and it made your fingers slow. Now I think it is what we have made here, a rope made of many small cords. It will hold us if we hold it together and take our turn at bearing its weight. It will not hold if we think it will bear us without us bearing it. When the dead come, we will not have time to argue about whose house the firewood came from. We will need to have already decided. We have decided. We will decide again where this does not reach. But this reaches far. He looked at Sansa and she looked back, and the look said 100 things that were not to be said before all these mouths and ears, but which they would say later. He looked at Davos and tried to tell him with an eyebrow the thank you he could not make in a room this full. He looked at Lyanna and tried to say without laughter that she had saved them all by insisting on arrows. He looked at Manderley and tried to say with no words at all that he saw him, all of him, the fat and the lean. He looked at Robert Glover and tried to say that he would not forget the shape of the hurt he had brought them all and tried to mend. When the moot ended, the great seal cooled. Wolkan rolled the parchment in dry linen and wrapped it and put it in the coffer made of oak and iron bands, the coffer that had belonged to some Stark who had once kept things precious that were not lives inside it. He put the driftwood carving atop it and set the lock. He handed the key to Jon. Jon handed the key to Sansa. Sansa handed the key to Davos. Davos looked at it and handed it to the eldest of the speakers, an old woman with eyes like flint. You keep it, Davos said. We'll be back for it every time we need to open it, and if we cannot, we will tell your children how to do it. That's the law. Trusts you. You trust it. The small folk who had had winter press its thumb into their bones looked at that and made a sound like wind moving through a good thick hedge. Not approval. Not relief. Something else. Something that was both and more. Jon walked out into the courtyard with Ghost at his knee. The moon had put a fine blade on every icicle. His breath went in and out and you could see it. When he turned, the godswood was there in the corner of his eye, patient as fingers folded around a cup by a man who means to drink when it is time and not before. Ash. He went to it because he always did when he wanted to ask something he would not know how to say to another mouth. The heart tree's face watched him. He knelt. You gave me no answer, he said, and smiled into the cold. Thank you for that. Ghost lowered his great head and breathed against his cheek. Far away, a horn blew, long and low and not in alarm. A watcher greeting a watcher at the change of the turn, telling the night that it was still being watched. The sound went up and out and came back along the white knife's edge of the moon. Tomorrow the dead might come again. Tomorrow a lord might decide that hunger tasted like insult and send riders to make it the other way around. Tomorrow a boy who had learned to read might decide that letters were more dangerous than knives and teach them to someone else all the same. Tomorrow they might win a river or lose one. Tomorrow they would argue about whether a woman's basket counted as a hearth if she had no roof. Tomorrow they would drag a new bench into the ring to make space for a new speaker from far up near the shadow of the wall. A woman with hair like iron and a son who had carved faces into sticks and left them in every snowdrift for the dead to look at. Tomorrow they would count sacks again and find them wanting and send ships anyway. He rose and set his hand on the face in the bark, and the bark did not change and the face did not, and he did. He went back to the hall. He took his place. He talked of nettle soup and oil and iron and who had to go where and why and what could be lifted and what had to be left and who would take the next turn riding the circuit and when the next moot would be called. 2 moons from now, Sansa said, reading his mind, and again when the river ice goes soft. Tighter, Davos said. We'll need to call it tighter than that if the dead learn to do something new. They will not, Lyanna said with contempt for the very idea. They are dead. They will not, Jon agreed, because he had learned that you sometimes had to decide things into being. The hall filled with their voices, and a boy came in with a pail and a girl came in behind him with a stack of bowls, and a soldier rose to take the bowls from her and put them on the table like a man who had learned what he was and what he was not. The fire crackled. The wind held its breath for a heartbeat and then tried the shutters again. The charter lay in its coffer, and its coffer in the keeping of a woman who had learned that hunger would not be soothed by pride. The moon laid a white line on the snow in the yard, and the old gods listened like all the trees of the world, leaning in towards this one hall, this one fire, this one man who had put his hand to a rope with all the others and called it law. Out beyond the walls, the watchers walked their turn with spears and with songs. A wolf lifted its head and found the scent of fish coming up from the harbor, and of bear fat rendering, and of pine smoke, and of men alive, many of them. The North remembered. The North learned. The North made new things with old words and old things with new ones. The snow tried to hide everything and could not quite, not here. Winterfell slept and woke and slept. The dead came less and the living less feared them, and then the dead came more and the living learned to fear again, which is not the worst thing men and women can learn. Letters went up and down the white roads. Seals pressed, wax cooled, hands warmed, rope pulled tight. Sansa sang to herself sometimes in the night, and it was not a song she had learned but one she had made. Davos dreamed of waves that were not frozen, and woke and set ink next to paper and found the words that the dumb luck of being alive had put into him. Manderley dreamed of a pie in which the only thing he could not eat was his own smile, and he woke and worked. Lyanna dreamed of wolves and woke smiling because she had teeth too. Jon dreamed of a hall so long it had no wall at one end, and of a fire so long it needed no tending, and of faces in wood that were not the heart trees and were. And he woke and did not need to ask the old gods anything because he had their answer, and it was the people who had put their breath on the cold air and made a sound. In the end, there was no end. That was the point. They fought when they had to. They buried when they had to. They counted. They returned the bread and the salt. They set their tallies. They cut wood. They cut hands when the law required it, and they bound them when they could. They told the story of the time a steward had to wear the apron of the woman he'd wronged until every steward knew the feel of linen against his pride. They told the story of the boy who had learned letters instead of dying, and of the bear girls who could pick a hanging apple at 40 paces, and of the king who did not pretend to know everything and so found out more than some who had. Years later, when men made rooms where law could be stored on shelves and remembered by those who had not been there when it was written, the driftwood face would sit in a case of polished glass, and those who came out of the cold to look at it would catch themselves pressing their fingers against their lips so they did not touch it. A child would ask her mother what it was, and the mother would say, "It is the answerer. It belongs to all of us." And the child would say, "What question did it answer?" And the mother would say, "The one we still ask and answer every time we are hungry and cold and together." Jon would be dead by then, and Sansa would be old or not. Davos would be gone on a ship or gone in the ground. Lyanna would have taught a dozen girls to find a pippin where there was none and put an arrow through it anyway. Manderley would have eaten less and been more satisfied. The dead would be a story again, as they always became in the mouths of those who had not seen them, but the law would be a thing you could point to. Oh, like an icicle or a wolf's track. On a last night, perhaps the last that was like this world and not the next, Jon stood alone in the godswood and spoke to the heart tree as if it could hear, and perhaps it could. "I forged a thing," he said, his mouth uncertain at his own words. "We all did. Kept us. It will keep them." He smiled, a small, surprised smile in the cold. "It was not a sword." Ghost put his big head under Jon's hand and pushed, and Jon let the wolf lead him back to the hall where the fire burned, and where men and women argued about the price of oil and the justice of cutting hands and whether a woman who mended nets for coin counted as a hearth if she slept alone. He listened. He spoke when he had to. He kept quiet when he did not. He went to the door as dawn put a pale line on the snow and watched the watchers coming in to warm their hands and those going out to take their places. He watched the faint line of smoke along the river and the sharper black line of the ships. He watched the light pick out the faces in the wood and turn them briefly gold. "What is it?" Sansa asked from behind him. "Only the light," he said. "Only the morning. Only the north," she said. "Only the law," Davos said, coming up with his cloak thrown over his shoulders like a man who had never had the time to wear one properly. "Only a rope. Only a thing we pull on together." "Only us," Lyanna said. with scorn and pride mingled as if they were the same spice. Jon laughed softly, and the sound misted and went away and left him warmed. Far away a horn sounded. Nearer, a woman shouted at a man to wipe his boots. Closer still, Ghost thumped his tail against the threshold the way a sentry might tap the butt of his spear. Jon stepped over and into the day, and the day took him like a thing it had been waiting for.